Hello students, I am Dr. Saliha Jamal, Faculty Department of Geography, Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. Welcome to today's class. Now we are here dealing with the topic physical vulnerability to climate change. In previous class we have already discussed about the different types of vulnerability, but it was in short. Now we are going to discuss it one by one in each lecture in detail. So let us start the class. So, when it comes to define the physical vulnerability, we know that generally it refers to the degree to which any country, a region, or even we can call it the ecosystem is exposed to, or either we can say impacted by the physical effects of the climate change. When we are talking about the physical effects, example you may take the effects from the storms, hurricanes, rise in temperature, rise in sea level, etc. So, overall, it can be said that it refers to the degree to which a country, a region is exposed to and impacted by the physical effects of climate change such as floods, droughts, rising sea level, etc. This physical vulnerability suggests that biophysical impacts of climate change will occur through various mechanisms and which will have significant influence on the future viability and integrity of the physical resource. That's why it's become very much important to understand what physical vulnerability is to climate change. If we take example, there are certain sectors which are mainly dependent upon the climate. In that, the common example that we can take here is the agricultural sector. We know agricultural sector is whole soul, it is mostly dependent upon the climate because any change in precipitation regime, change in temperature, or we can say climate shifts can impact the yield of agricultural productivity, and that will disrupt the chain supply, and many times the countries who are mainly dependent upon the agricultural economy or either we can say primary economy. So, it is a vulnerable sector to climate change as the parameters if there is a change in temperature, precipitation which will have significant negative impact on the agricultural yield. Similarly, if we talk about the natural ecosystem, here we are talking about the natural ecosystem, vulnerability occurs when individuals or communities of species are already stressed. If we are talking about certain deforested area or the area suffering from the pollution, it means it is already stressed, means deforestation, as we have already learned and understood in previous lecture that the deforested areas that reduces the carbon absorbing capacity of the region because it is a natural carbon sink. It takes the forest takes carbon from the atmosphere and they used it in the presence of sunlight for the photosynthesis purpose. But if it is cleared off, certainly the level of carbon dioxide will increase and it will again exacerbate the impact of greenhouse effect which will lead to global warming. So, the natural ecosystem which is already stressed, or we can say the communities or species which is already stressed, like the coral reefs due to the acidification of the oceans, or generally where the threshold of potentiality is irreversible changes are breached through the climatic change. So, they are more vulnerable to climatic change. So, two things here you have to remember: if certain sectors which are dependent upon the climate, for example like agriculture, or even you can quote the example of fisheries, and even the communities or the ecosystem which is already stressed, they are more vulnerable to the climate change. Here you can see certain deaths of the fishes, that is due to the certain changes in the marine environment. You can see the impact of the drought. So many cracks have appeared in the soil, etc. So actually this physical vulnerability to climate change is influenced by the various factors. So we are going to study these factors one by one. So physical vulnerability is influenced by the geographical location. When we talk about the geographical location, it refers whether the population, a community or an ecosystem where it is particularly located and what are the factors, physical factors that is affecting its vulnerability. So you can quote here the example of coastline. It is very much obvious that the coastal regions are mainly vulnerable to the rising sea levels, flood prone areas, so they are at higher risk. Similarly, we can also take the examples of the mountains, floodplains, determines its exposure to the specific climate risk. So actually where the particular region, community, population or we can say the ecosystem is located, that play a very important role in terms of the susceptibility to the climate change. You can here take the real world example. For example, low lying coastal cities such as New Orleans or Miami are vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surges, which can lead to flooding and infrastructural damage. Because these are the coastal cities, that's why we can say they are most prone to storm surges or we can say flooding, sea level rise, etc. And as we know, due to the climatic change, glaciers and ice caps are melting and sea level is rising day by day. That's why especially the coastal cities are most prone to these types of impact. Even you can take the example for the communities which are situated along the floodplains. For example, parts of Bangladesh and Bihar which are at heightened risk of flooding either from the rainfall or either from the sea level rise. Another key factor which plays a very important role in physical vulnerability to climate change is the infrastructure. We know poorly designed infrastructure or if it is a certain infrastructure is not made up of strong material, so they will be more vulnerable. So inadequate infrastructure and we can say poorly designed infrastructure that exacerbate the damage to the extreme weather events, maybe like hurricanes, storms, floods, heat waves, etc. The condition and resilience of infrastructure, for example, we are talking about roads, bridges, buildings that play a very important role because poorly constructed and outdated infrastructure is more susceptible to the damage from the extreme events. Here you can take example, regions prone to hurricane. The one example here I would like to quote that Caribbean or the Gulf Coast of US, that this region mainly face risk of destruction from more intense storms due to climate change. That's why we can say the infrastructure here is either old or we can say poorly designed and it is not made up of strong material, so they face more intense risk from the storms due to the climate change. Even it can be said all the third world countries of the world are having underdeveloped infrastructure. They are having inadequate infrastructure in terms of dwelling, roads, transportation networks, etc. due to the financial crisis, and therefore they are more vulnerable to physical destruction due to the climate change. Another key factor that affects the physical vulnerability, that is a very important factor because it is related one way to other way, not only to the physical vulnerability but also to the economic vulnerability and also to the social vulnerability. So that is the economic resources. We know that the communities or even the underdeveloped and the developing countries with the limited financial resources will struggle how to adapt to the changes that is brought by the climate change and making them, these communities, these underdeveloped and developing countries more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Similarly, if we talk about the communities having lower income level, they will have access to fewer resources. So they will not be able to adapt to climate impacts, making them more vulnerable. So overall we can say here mainly the less developed countries, developing countries or the communities having low level of income will have less access to the resources. That's why they will not be able to adapt to the climatic changes as much as the countries which are financially strong. So limited access even to the insurance, or we can say emergency services and health care also require financial assistance, and if it is not available then that can exacerbate this vulnerability. For instance, the areas like California, Central Valley experience physical vulnerability due to prolonged droughts affecting water supply, agriculture, thereby their economy and ecosystem. So basically here we can say mainly the countries whose economy is dependent upon the primary sector like agriculture, like fishing, or we can say lumbering. So these are some of the sectors which are directly or indirectly very much dependent upon the climate. So if there are some negative climatic impact, certainly the economies of these regions will be impacted. You can see here condition of soil due to drought. In such condition, there may be crop failure or either the crop yield will be less, thus disrupting the economy of the region. Another very important factor for making the physical vulnerability more vulnerable, that is the health. Population which is already having pre-existing health issues, or we can say limited access to the health care, maybe due to the income level, they are more vulnerable to certain climatic impacts like heat waves or pandemics, mainly exacerbated by the climate change. For example, any population or a people who is already stressed or having the pre-existing disease like cardiovascular disease or any of the respiratory disease, so they will be more we can say they will be more susceptible to the climatic changes like heat waves or we can say pandemics, etc. So population with higher rates of chronic health condition, maybe people suffering with chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, or maybe the people having limited access to the health care, they are generally more vulnerable not only to the heat stress but various vector borne diseases also. So here we can give the example, cities like Phoenix or Los Angeles are mainly susceptible to the extreme heat events, particularly affecting vulnerable population which is not having proper access to the cooling resources. So in these cities, if the community is not having the proper resources to of cooling, then surely they will be impacted. Another key factor is ecosystem sensitivity. The resilience to ecosystem in terms of the wetland, forests affects vulnerability. We know the wetlands play a very important role not only economically but socially also, culturally also, and it provides a number of functions. Similarly, lots of functions are also provided by the forest, not only ecologically or we can say in maintaining the ecological balance, but also in economic activities, etc. So the resilience of local is so that's why we can say the resilience of local ecosystem will certainly affect the vulnerability. If the ecosystem is healthy, that can provide buffer against the climatic impact such as flooding and heat. For example, if we are talking about if the ecosystem is healthy, suppose if nowadays what the data says, the wetland bodies are shrinking, they are disappearing, it means we are losing the we can say that we are losing the storing capacity of excess of water that we receive during the rain. So if that capacity is lost, certainly the water will be lost through the surface runoff and it cannot be stored in that storage sink or wetland. That will affect not only the aquatic life, aquatic ecosystem, but it is also a source which recharge the ground, maintaining the underground water level. So these all things will be affected. Similarly for the forest, forests are the natural carbon sink. If mainly forest area is reduced, certainly the carbon dioxide content will be increased in the atmosphere. That's why it is said that healthy ecosystem can provide buffers against the climatic impact such as flooding and heat. Certain ecosystems like coral reefs or alpine regions are particularly sensitive to the temperature changes and can experience significant degradation. Here we are talking about some of the ecosystems similar way due to the geographical location. Some location are somewhat much sensitive than the other. Similarly, we have already said that according to the economic level, socio-economic level, if the income level is low, someone is having income level is high, so it will affect the vulnerability if they are having not access to proper resources. In the similar way, certain ecosystems are also more sensitive. You can give the example of coral reefs. These are more sensitive to the temperature changes. When the temperature changes takes place, or when the global temperature rise, ocean temperature rises, what happens actually from the coral polyps which builds up these coral reefs, they expel their algae from their tissue, thus turning into white. That is known as coral bleaching. So these are more affected to the climatic changes. In the similar way, alpine forest, if the temperature rises, as we know, they are more conducive for the cooler environment, and if the temperature rises, certainly that will be impacted by these changes. For example, places like Australia, California, what they are facing the increased risk of wildfire due to the rising temperature and prolonged dry condition, thus not only threatening the homes and the natural habitats but also impacting certain other communities, or we can say wildlife also. So these are the few examples how ecosystem sensitive works in vulnerability, particularly the physical vulnerability. You can see here the condition about the alpine forest, which is much suited for the cooler regions. Here you can see the forest fire, and I have already said the Australia region is very much prone to the forest fire nowadays because of rising temperature plus prolonged dry condition in that particular area. There are some regions, we can say, or the ecosystem which are more sensitive to the climate. Inherently, they are more sensitive to the changes in temperature, precipitation, or even we can say the sea level. For example, we can take example of Arctic regions. Arctic regions which generally remains we can say frozen throughout the year. So these Arctic regions are more vulnerable to the temperature changes which would result in melting ice and therefore sea level rise. It is but obvious due to global warming, global temperature are rising, then what will happen? The Arctic regions will be more vulnerable, their ice will start melting, which will certainly will be proceeded into sea level rise. So these are this type of ecosystem, they are more sensitive to the climate. Not only this, if we are talking about the food and water security, changes in climatic condition can affect the agricultural productivity through water scarcity, maybe due to the drought condition, or many times the crops may be destroyed due to the flood condition. So you can here give the example that like indigenous communities in the Arctic are physically vulnerable as ice are melting there, and they are mainly dependent upon traditional hunting and fishing practices, which is leading to food insecurity due to the melting of ice. So there are certain changes which take place food and even in water security due to prolonged drought, we can say, or due to the rising temperature, global temperature, or due to the sea level rise. So they are more vulnerable. In terms of the community preparedness, what actually the preparedness do? When we are prepared for something, then we can reduce the negative impact. So here we are talking about preparedness regarding the negative impacts of the climate change, maybe in terms of the hurricane, storm surges, maybe in terms of the we can say drought condition, or even in terms of the temperature rise, erratic rainfall, etc. So if we are already prepared, then we can reduce the impact. So the level of awareness and preparedness within the community can influence the vulnerability. A well-aware community which is prepared for the certain events from the climate change can reduce the negative impact of the climate change. Communities with effective emergency response plans and public education are better equipped to handle the climate impacts. Not only this, another factor, that is population density. It is said that the high population density may experience greater impacts from the climatic events. The reason is due to the congestion and due to the limited evacuation routes, increasing the risks to the resident. For example, if any coastal city is mainly impacted through the hurricane or storm surges, or maybe flood due to the erratic rainfall or sea level rise, and if it is a high density region, high density city, surely it will take more time to evacuate the people from that particular place. So not only this, the congestion and limited evacuation routes, that may increase the risk of the resident. So if we are going to understand these factors which are playing major role in physical vulnerability due to the climate change, then we can take smart decisions and we can help in inform strategies in order to reduce the vulnerability and enhance the resilience to climate change impacts. Now, you have studied the key factors which are affecting or playing very important role in physical vulnerability. If we have understood the key factors, now the next step is that we have to proceed for physical vulnerability analysis. Now the question may arise in your mind, what is physical vulnerability analysis? So actually it is a process of evaluating the likelihood, the susceptibility of the physical assets, or we can say infrastructure, ecosystem, environment to particular damage or destruction, or even we can say hazards that may be natural or anthropogenic driven, or that may be environmental degradation through the climatic change. So we are going to evaluate the likelihood and susceptibility of the assets, infrastructure, ecosystem, community, or we can say certain of types of disaster which is mainly impacting these all physical assets. The goal of the physical vulnerability is to understand the potential impact of this hazard from which the particular community or the ecosystem is affected. So first we are going to evaluate the likelihood of the, we can say, or the susceptibility of physical assets, infrastructure to the degradation or from the hazards or disaster that is mainly related to the climate change. Then we are going to understand what will be the potential impact of these hazards. How much damage can take place, whether we are talking about life, property, infrastructure and all. If we are going to understand what, how much the impact will be seen from the particular hazard, then we can develop the strategies to mitigate that risk accordingly. If once we plan for certain strategies, then we can reduce the estimates of number of people, communities or the ecosystem that is potentially impacted. So we have to evaluate the types of susceptibility to the particular infrastructure, asset or we can say environment or ecosystem from the hazards or disaster that is related to the climate change. Then we have to understand the potential impact of those hazards on the community and the people. Once we understand, then we can suggest or draft strategies in order to mitigate that risk, and then only we can reduce the estimates of number of people or ecosystem that is impacted through the climate change. So this is what we can say physical vulnerability analysis is. For this we need certain components. For this analysis we need certain components. Just like hazard identification, we have to identify the specific types of hazard to physical vulnerability. For example, if the coastal area we are talking about, it is mainly vulnerable to flooding, or we can say sea level rise, or we can say to the hurricanes. Or if we are talking about the agriculture sector, so it is very much we can say vulnerable to the rise in temperature, or we can say erratic rainfall. So if we are talking about the coral reefs, so they are very much vulnerable to the changes brought by the climatic change, that is maybe in the rise of temperature. So first we have to identify the specific hazard that may include the natural hazard or human made hazard, or we can say climate related hazard. Once we identify the hazard, then exposure assessment is done. Secondly, what exposure assessment is done, which involves determining of physical assets, maybe the building, maybe the housing, various infrastructure, or we can say population exposure, which are exposed to particular type of hazard. So we go for the hazard assessment, what type of assets, infrastructure, population is exposed to that particular type of hazard. Identification of hazard, then exposure assessment, then vulnerability of the structure. We are talking about here physical structure, maybe based on the type of material, maybe based on the type of design of construction, maybe based on the age of the infrastructure, location, etc. What type of vulnerability of structure is there? For example, older buildings which are poorly built and poorly maintained, mainly located in floodplains, are more vulnerable to the climate change. So vulnerability of structure is assessed, and then finally impact assessment is performed. What is this impact assessment? Evaluating the potential consequences of physical damage in terms of loss of life or injuries, in terms of economic losses, disruption of services, environmental damage, etc. Once we have done the hazard identification in terms of the type of hazard, then type of population or number of population or infrastructure exposure, then we have done what type of vulnerability of structure is there, whether due to the age or poor management or poor structures, etc. Then the impact assessment is done, that is to know the potential consequences of physical damage in terms of economic losses, loss of life, etc. Then risk assessment prioritization is done. That is what very important step. Here we are generally identifying the most impacted or affected area, that are the risk zone, that need priority attention for policy implications. For example, there may be high risk areas, medium risk areas and low risk areas. So it is very much obvious that priority is to be provided to the high risk areas. So risk assessment and prioritization, what we do, we identify the risk zone into high, medium, low and very low. Then the scenario analysis is performed. In this, we generally analyze the potential impacts of the physical assets, maybe in terms of the earthquake scenarios, flood scenarios, climate change scenarios, through stimulating different hazard events. What the potential impacts can take place? We generally stimulate different hazard events in order to know the type of destruction that may take place. And lastly, we proceed for the resilience and adaptation strategies. This is also very important. In order to, by knowing all this data and all these things, now the time comes where we proceed to develop the strategies in order to reduce the physical vulnerability, such as retrofitting and strengthening, we may proceed our strategies through the land use planning, which type of land is suitable for what. Certain land may be suitable for afforestation, reforestation, may be suitable for the agriculture purpose, may be suitable for the residential purpose. So we may proceed for the land use planning, and also early warning system, which is very important nowadays. You can see that we have due to the technological advancement, we have already reduced the loss of life mainly from the coastal areas through the hurricanes, storms, etc. So early warning system is also very important. Then finally, climate resilient infrastructure is important. That example, you can see the climate resilient infrastructure in terms of types of housing, in terms of green belt that we are now constructing around the different buildings, apartments, etc. Or overall we can see green infrastructure, etc. So resilience and adaptation studies is the most important part that completes this vulnerability analysis after going through the various steps. So finally, the indicators used in the physical vulnerability analysis. What are the indicators that is used? Firstly, the building vulnerability index, that is structural integrity and hazard resistance of the building. If we are concerned with the building vulnerability index, it means we are very much concerned with the type of construction material used, what type of design is used, or we can say adherence to the building codes is followed or not. So this is one of the important indicator used in physical vulnerability, building vulnerability index. Next comes the critical infrastructure index. What is critical infrastructure index? Critical infrastructure like roads, bridges, railways, power plants, how much it is resilient to the natural and human made disaster, that is very important to assess. Then hazard exposure maps. Now with the help of newer technologies, we can say remote sensing and GIS based map can be produced in order to highlight the risk zone, in order to highlight the priority areas for the strategies and policy implementation, etc. And then disaster risk reduction index, that is what? That is measuring the capacity of an area to mitigate, adapt, or to, we can say, recover from the natural disaster based on their physical infrastructure, based on the inside resources, based on their emergency preparedness, governance, etc. We generally measure the capacity for an area, how much that area is capable to mitigate to a particular type of incidents. So this is all for today's lecture for the physical vulnerability to the climate change. Thank you.